Hey there, Jim Johnson for Accent Help here. And I had a question from someone on YouTube about the American R sounds. And it seems like an easy question, but it's actually kind of a nightmare, especially when we start to reflect the reality of it and try to deal with variations for different accents. So even slight variations in accents. So if we're looking at narrow transcription, well, for a moment, I guess broad transcription, people will usually write the R like that, more like a regular looking R. But when we get narrow, that's actually representing the more Scottish trilled R, that rrr, we might think of that as Scottish. So we're not talking about that. Instead, the symbol that tends to be used is a turned R, so an upside down R. And that's more the American consonant R, like red, that kind of a sound at the beginning of a word. Whereas what's commonly used, some people will use this or just stay broad with the upright one, but some people will then transcribe the R that's more the vowel-like or that's vowel plus R as er. Now, on its own, sometimes people will use these as two different versions of and er. So on the vowel chart, we've got and the schwa. I know that's not a big difference. They're so close where they happen in the mouth, there's not a big difference between them. This would be like murder, further. Okay, so that's one version of an R, but then we get a vowel plus an R. So if we take the word rare, for example, oftentimes it'll get transcribed like that. Now, what happens for many Americans is one thing that's inherent in most American speakers is a little bit of lip rounding on the R sounds. So there is a diacritic for the lip rounding, and that oftentimes affects vowels. So notice I've got a little bit of going. It's not just the R happening in my mouth, but there's a little extra rounding that changes the resonant space. So it does shift the R sounds, and it'll even oftentimes happen for the post-vowel R. Rare, that little bit of lip rounding that's more common for Americans and maybe not as common in some other accents. So that's one of the tweaks that we do. Well, when you're talking about some American accents, the R's become what a lot of people will call harder. And I might transcribe those as this R still, but with a wavy line through it that means velarized or pharyngealized, meaning pulling back towards the velum, the soft palate, or towards the pharynx, the throat. So that's a way I could transcribe that, and then just carry this R over to be the post-vowel R. So that's another way that I could transcribe more of what you might think of as a Texas or a Southern rare, rare. That's more like that as opposed to rare, rare. All right, so that's one of those things that happens. Some American accents you get non-rhotic, where it becomes rare, like New York, Boston, with stronger versions of accents. Up in Maine, you might get someone who says rare. So you'll get that R dropping. Commonly occurs in many New Orleans accents, some African American accents. That will happen even in the North. You will get that R dropping. So you get variations on that, okay? So it could be non-rhotic for some American speakers. The lip rounding is one of the things. But another thing that sort of happens, somebody was in this question, I think they really want to know, how do we do it? Well, there is a degree of tongue bracing where you kind of brace your tongue against your upper teeth a little bit further back, so sort of towards your molars. You almost take your teeth and you bite down on the sides of your tongue, but you do it really, really loosely, so you're not going to hopefully cause any blood here. But there may be some mouth closing that's common but not necessary to create that R, and then even the lighter R, rare. There's still that little bit of the sides of the tongue touching, but maybe not quite as much of the tongue for this slightly lighter vowel R than with the heavier consonant R. Rare. It's also common, in addition to the lip rounding, for Americans to maybe do a little extra sort of pressure from what some other speakers might do, such as say, modern RP speakers, re, I think that R will not be quite as braced on the teeth. And for Americans in general, it is braced. Now, how do you reach towards that? The challenge is it really depends on what your R is, what your placement is. A lot of Americans, I think their placement is a little bit back in the mouth, and that causes the tongue to sort of go back and maybe brace a little bit more, get a little bit retracted. One of those things I was sort of showing by putting that wavy line through it, that diacritic of velarized or pharyngealized, sort of moving back or possibly up, right? So it depends on your speaking. Like if you're someone who has a tendency to retroflex with your placement because you're, say, from India, rare, you might have a challenge of it because the tip of your tongue may be sort of curving back, going as opposed to the tip of the tongue is maybe a little bit more sort of looser for an American accent and also for an RP, a modern RP speaker. Re, re. The front of it doesn't do as much bracing. So how do you get to this? It's really hard to say without speaking specifically about from this accent to this accent. Here's how you do it. So that's my attempt at going a little bit more in depth about American R's, or at least some of them, because of course there will be variations because we have so many different accents. For more info on accents in general, check out accenthelp.com.